Great. Well, it's a great pleasure today to welcome Professor Martin Rudwick. Particularly great pleasure because I'm Bob White, I'm Associate Director of the Faraday, but by profession my day job is a geologist. And Martin actually started in the same department as I am a little while before I got there. Was an undergraduate, a PhD student and a lecturer there. Before he then joined the very new then Department of History and Philosophy of Science in Cambridge. He moved on after that to the Free University. I don't know whether this is the right order, but he was certainly in the Free University, Princeton, and University of California, before he returned to the delights of Ely, where he now lives. So it's a great pleasure to have Martin talking about the apparent conflict that there has been between geology and Genesis, and how this is really just a myth. So I hope he's going to demythologize it for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. It's a great pleasure to be able to address this distinguished audience. Yes, I was trained as a geologist and then reinvented myself as a historian, much to the dismay of the scientists who were then my colleagues. I think things have got better since then. Because I sort of switched horses in mid-career, I capitalized on my hands-on experience of the earth sciences by specializing ever since in my research, at least, in the history of the earth sciences. And in that context, of course, I immediately came up against this story that the history of geology has been disastrously hampered, held back, opposed, etc., by those who were standing up for the truth of Genesis. Now, I call this is pretty well-known stuff, that there was this supposed conflict between geology and Genesis, not only at the present day. And one of my colleagues posted to me by email earlier this week something I hadn't seen in The Guardian, which was an item about the imminent opening of the world's first creation science museum near Cincinnati, I think, in Kentucky, which is not exactly an enlightened state. And that is a reminder that in America, though thankfully not in the same degree in Europe, in which term, by the way, I include our own offshore island, we are still up against this kind of problem, which the modern earth scientists in America have a lot of trouble with. Anyway, it's well known that there's a supposed conflict historically, and over the years, while I've been doing my historical research on the early history of geology, which has been really to try and understand how what geologists now take absolutely for granted, how this first came to be worked out. While I've been doing that research, again and again, almost like clockwork, as it were, when I explained to my friends and colleagues what I was trying to do, that I was trying to understand the history, the sort of dawning awareness of that the whole of human history was a tiny sliver of time at the tail end of an immensely long and eventful history of the Earth, or geohistory as geologists often call it. The reaction would almost always be, oh well then, I suppose you have to deal with the conflict between geology and Genesis, or between geologists and the church with a capital C, or most of all, between science with a capital S and religion with a capital R. Well, actually not, because what I've tried to do is to be as good a historian as I can be, and by following the historical actors themselves, I came to realize that this is largely a myth, that the so-called conflict was very, very specific in the way I'll explain in a moment. Anyway, the conflict is assumed to be central by the general public, and of course this is a myth which is sedulously fostered by those appointed spokespersons for science with a capital S, who I think are legitimately, we can legitimately describe as atheistic fundamentalists. I don't need to suggest who I have in mind for that label. And yet, it's a myth in both senses of the word. It's a myth in the everyday colloquial sense that it's largely untrue, but it's also, more importantly, a myth in the more important, in the true and technical sense of the word, in that it is a story which is doing work for certain people, ideological work, and that's very obvious, I think, in the present world. And the myth, it's a myth, the myth of conflict with Galileo and Darwin as stereotypes, and this Geology and Genesis business is another one, has a great deal of power in the public sphere, and I think we should be aware of that. So I want to try to demythologize or deconstruct this story of perennial and intrinsic conflict. And what it simply needs is some really decent work in the history of the relevant science and the history of religion in the same period. And I say that because so often the story of conflict is based on very bad history, usually dressed up in popular form. And the main point I want to get across in this respect is very simply that you cannot understand this myth or understand why it needs demythologizing unless you recognize that the socio-political context in which the relevant debates happened are all important. And for example, Andrew Dixon White, the author of a very well-known late 19th century book which first popularized the metaphor of the warfare between science and religion, cannot be understood without taking into account the political situation that he was in as the first president of Cornell, trying to stake out a place for higher education in the US which would not be under the thumb of a particular denomination. Anyway, so I would say that the most important thing in understanding this bit of history is that one has got to have some empathy with the people concerned, and this is one of the problems in that although I think by and large professional historians are taught and trained how to have this empathy with people who believed in magic and alchemy and astrology and all that sort of thing, and they do a very good job in trying to get inside the mental world of people in earlier periods and understand, even if what they believed in is what modern age has abandoned. You've still got to understand it from the inside. And this is one of the problems, I think, with the history of the whole area of science and religion, in that there is so much hostility and sheer ignorance, particularly among modern intellectuals, towards anything religious. Amazing ignorance, which people simply wouldn't put up with if it was some other part of the past world of knowledge. And the other thing is that we've got to be alert to the diversity of the personnel involved, the people involved, the historical period, the geographical place, and the different kinds of science. We've always got to ask who thought there was a conflict, who experienced a conflict, when, what period, where, what country or part of the world, and what, in other words, in relation to what kind of science. And here I think the whole thing has been really, the waters have been muddied by what I like to call the Anglophone heresy of believing in a thing called science with a capital S. Whereas in reality, and I think most people even scientists who stop to think about this rather than propagating an ideology, realize that there is an enormous diversity of the sciences, and what's true of one science may not be true of another science at all. Now I want to move quickly from these generalities to my specific topic, and want to start with the issue which always comes up first and is put into greatest prominence, and that is the question of the age of the Earth. We can see this in relation to modern American creationism, which champions the idea of what they call a young Earth, what I call historically a short time scale. When I was teaching in San Diego, in California, just up the road, a few miles away, was a creationist museum, a very small one compared to the one that's now in the process of being developed. And it was just amazing to see how they devised a young Earth interpretation of things like the Grand Canyon. Just staggering, because they were, in effect, reinventing an artificial wheel, in the sense that their arguments were replaying things that were arguments that were played out at a scholarly level 3 centuries ago in the 17th century. And so I will go plunge straight into the 17th century. I need the first slide. If we can get that curtain pulled back. I'm sorry, you're having to...
It's on the motor, we have to press the button.
You're having to re-enter the Stone Age, I'm afraid, because I am still living in the era BP, before PowerPoint. I've been too busy doing my own research to find time to learn how to do this. So this is an old-fashioned slide. And some of you may not have seen the original text in which the much maligned Archbishop Usher in the 1650s, in the 17th century, actually proposed this date of 4004 BC, which you see in the right-hand column, which is the year before Christ. And you see it's not the only chronology that he's dealing with. He's dealing with another thing called the Julian period, which I won't bother with. And this is the context in which he claims that to have calculated the precise moment of the creation as the beginning of time, interestingly enough. I like to tease my friends who are cosmologists and astrophysics by saying that their talk about the Big Bang is remarkably similar in many ways to what Archbishop Usher was putting forward. Now, the main point about putting this on is just to emphasize what some of you will know very well, that Usher was just a not very distinguished member of a practitioner of a whole science which was called chronology, which was a science of textual scholarship, not even primarily biblical. The biblical chronology came into it because it was thought to be one of the oldest continuous records of historical events. But mainly it was a historical science. It was a branch of human history. And the goal of it was to construct a world history which would be, as it were, cross-cultural. And I put in, next slide, I put in, some years ago, I made a little histogram of Hush based on Usher's great volume, which is almost as big as this great doorstop of a volume of my own that I brought in as my little sales pitch. This histogram shows the pages per century which Usher gave, and I've put a time scale in, being once a geologist, always a geologist. The time scale, time goes upwards, and you have creation at the bottom, and you have the birth of Christ at 4004 BC, and Usher ends his narrative of AD 73 just after the fall of Jerusalem. And what you notice there is that the vast majority of his book, the detailed, learned scholarship, is focused on the last few centuries, because that's where most of the evidence was. And there's practically nothing. He skips from very, very quickly from creation right up to around the Exodus. So that just shows the public misapprehension of what on earth Usher thought he was up to. And the other thing which is very often misunderstood about this. This is I'm talking about the 17th century, really, the early modern period, 16th, 17th century. The other thing, next slide, please. This is the frontispiece from another very famous work, somewhat later than Usher, another generation or two after Usher. This is Burnett's Sacred Theory of the Earth. And the frontispiece in those days served very much like a dust jacket in a publisher's blurb on a modern book. In other words, a visual summary of the book. And here, some of you may know this very well, but here we have Christ, I am Alpha and Omega, standing astride 7 successive phases in the history of the Earth, with the present right in the middle, and the flood in the past, and the supposed conflagration which you get in Peter's first letter in the future. Now the point about that is that although it's arranged in a circle, it is in fact a linear kind of history, and it has a sort of a cosmic environment of angels, but above all it has the figure of Christ in charge of the whole thing from beginning to end. Very standard, well-known biblical motif. But the point I want to make is, if you look at Burnett's book, the position that he's arguing against is not what we might expect from a sort of, a modern standpoint of a very long time scale. He's suggesting a very short time scale, of course, because it's standard for his period. There was no very good reason to suppose otherwise. But the reason, the position that he is opposed to, as I say, not a sort of modern time scale of millions of years or a few billions, but Aristotle's concept of eternalism. It's a concept of an uncreated eternal cosmos, is what somebody like Burnett and lots of his contemporaries were campaigning against. So at that period, in the 17th century, the conflict, insofar as there was a conflict, was between 2 alternatives, neither of which was the modern concept of a very long but finite history of the Earth. The conflict was between the standard orthodox and consensual picture of a short and finite history, and on the other hand, the Aristotelian concept of an infinitely long and therefore uncreated kind of history, where everything wasn't in fact a history because it just went on and on. Now my torch is given out. Another bit of low technology to do without that. So the modernity, it consisted in extent, was not what happened in the development of modernity in about the age of the Earth was to extend the short time scale, but specifically to recognize that a great deal of the history of the Earth was prehistorical and even pre-human. That is the real novelty. And by the time you get to the 18th century, the relevant savants, and I like to call them savants rather than scientists, because scientists has all the wrong anachronistic connotations, the relevant savants who worked on what they called natural history became aware that there was good evidence for an immensely long time scale, although they couldn't put any figures to it. But it doesn't actually matter that you couldn't put any figures to it. In geology, we weren't able to put any decent figures really until after the discovery of radioactivity at the very end of the 19th century, first years of the 20th century. It didn't matter. You could do very good geology, and on the assumption not the assumption, that with the evidence of an immensely long time scale, without having to be able to put figures to it. So that's what was already the case in the 18th century. Next slide, please. And the reasons that was widely thought were, I think, 2 in particular. One was, this is just a view in the French Alps, but it could be anywhere really. The Canadian Rockies showed this very clearly, where you can actually see immense piles of sedimentary strata, thousands of feet thick, or high in this case. When you look at them close up, you see that many of them are made of layers of rock, often containing obvious marine shells, which have obviously lived on the spot. Some of them are sort of, you can see that they've obviously lived on the spot, they haven't been thrown together in confusion at all. And the implication was pretty clear that these represent a very, very long time scale. Next slide shows an 18th century manuscript slice or section through the edge of the Italian Alps, distinguishing one formation of strata after another. And the scale of this, one of the ones in the middle, marked N actually, is also labelled as being 3,000 feet thick. So it's an immense thickness of strata, and it became absolutely inconceivable that all this could be compressed into a short time scale. Of course, it isn't totally inconceivable because some people do still conceive it, and that's what these American fundamentalists currently do with, for example, with the Grand Canyon. They say that these thousands of feet of sediments have all been deposited in a few years. And this thick lot of strata was one reason why it was the general view, even in the 18th century, that the timescale must be immensely long. The other one was to do with volcanoes. Next slide, please. It actually shows one of pictures from Sir William Hamilton's famous book on Vesuvius, showing one of the eruptions of Vesuvius. And the point is that there were historical records of one eruption after another. Next slide shows the largest volcano in Europe, namely Etna. And this is a late 18th century sketch showing all these volcanic cones, some of them with lava flows, the dark stuff coming out of them, and many of them dated from historical records. And one could get a very good idea, because the records have been so well kept on Etna ever since antiquity. You get a very good idea of how much of this enormous 10,000 foot cone with all these little sort of subsidiary volcanoes on the flanks, how much of this had been accumulated within historical with a period of historical records, the last 2,500 years or so. And it was very clearly a very, very small fraction of the whole. This was a very striking piece of evidence at the time that this volcano, the whole volcano, must stretch, its history must stretch back far long before any recorded history. So by the end of the 18th century, there was a very strong qualitative sense of what geologists now sometimes call deep time, to match the cosmologist's deep space. And it is not important that it was unquantified. The quantification came much later. And this sense of the immensely long history of the Earth was only strengthened was still further strengthened, I should say, in the early 19th century. Now, how was all this related to views about the meaning of Genesis and the rest of the Bible? Well, I think the important point here is to make is that by the late 18th century, among savants, or what we were including the people we would now call scientists, this was simply unimportant, whether they were religious or not, because there was a long-standing hermeneutic tradition going right back to the patristic era, according to which, well, if you would like to try and match what was being found scientifically with the narrative in Genesis 1, well, you could say, well, it looks as though the days of the Genesis account correspond to immensely long periods of time in the history of the Earth. Or you could say alternatively that Genesis 1 was simply a story about human history. There were various ways to deal with it, and it became pretty marginal issue. Also, I think far more importantly, the literalism, which had been pretty much a novelty, literalistic interpretation had been novelty in the 17th century. By the late 18th, in what's often called the Romantic period, were beginning to yield to a renewed sense of the multivocality of biblical language, and particularly to the sense that the meaning of the biblical narratives might be actually obscured by this excessive interest in exactly what this might have meant scientifically. The example, the little metaphor, or the anecdote that I like to use in this context is if you think of Haydn's great oratorio Die Schöpfung, the creation, which was first performed in Vienna in the 1790s, to rapturous applause by the music going public, the Viennese public, which is some of you will know, and some of you may even have sung in it, as I have. Wonderful work, which is based on Genesis 1. Haydn had been, when he was living in London a few years earlier, had been an acquaintance of, or even I think probably a friend of, a naturalist called John Hunter, who was certainly well aware of the immense timescale of the Earth. I think it's very likely that Haydn was well aware of this, but my argument is that it was completely irrelevant to Haydn. Haydn was very devout Catholic Christian, and said at the time that he put his religious life into the composition of Schöpfung as much as into any of his compositions. But it seems to me that there's no reason to imagine that he would have thought it was of any interest, or not of any religious importance. It might be a scientifically fascinating subject, but not of any religious importance to say, well, you know, when did all this occur? How many thousands of years ago? Just not important. So that's in the late 18th century, and it's only in the 1820s, well into the 19th century, and more specifically only in this strange benighted country of ours here, that there was a reversion to literalism in the movement that was often called by its adherents scriptural geology, which was entirely outside the circles of savants or of scientists, specifically of geologists, including, and it was attacked most vehemently by those geologists, and they called themselves geologists by the 1820s, by those geologists who were believing Christians. It was, in other words, it was a conflict which was played out on a dimension of social groups, and this conflict between so-called scriptural geology and what people who called themselves scientific geologists, including those who were religious, was an early predecessor of the modern conflict that earth scientists in America have with the creationists. So much for the creation story. Now quickly moving on to, I want to say a little bit about the story of the flood. So we move on from the first chapter of Genesis to the 6th to 8th chapters. And the important point here, I think, is to say that at the time, and I'm now going to be talking mostly about the early 19th century, at that time, the flood story was seen to be historical in character, in a way which was no longer applied to the creation story. And this is because it appeared to be based on some kind of, at least in Genesis, you could trace back a line of historical narrative back to Noah's flood, and more importantly, similar stories were being discovered in non-European cultures, even as far away as China. So it appeared to be an intercultural phenomenon. And it did look as though, well, whether you believe that the stories were accurate or legendary or garbled in one way or another, or purely mythical in the technical sense, nevertheless, the event was historical in character. It was part of the Earth's history and part of human history. And specifically, it was seemed to be a sort of boundary event between human history and this now extremely long pre-human history, which the record of the rocks and the volcanoes and so on was turning up. And it was a boundary event because the evidence for it seemed to be come uniquely both from human history and from natural records. And the general attitude to this was that these were complementary, not conflicting sources of evidence. There were natural documents as well as human documents that fed into this. So in the early 19th century, there was a very important scientific theory, which was usually called diluvial, derived from the word for deluge, of course, which was often described as dealing with an apparent event in the past, which was often called the geological deluge. And it was a separate question whether the geological deluge was the same event as Noah's flood. People were not always consistent in using deluge for one and flood for the other, but I find analytically it's a helpful distinction to make, because they were recognizing that they were distinct things. And the diluvial theory, because of its supposed equation with the biblical flood, has been sneered at consistently by historians, with a few honourable exceptions, for I don't know how long. But when you look at the historical records and you try to think yourself back into the world of these people, these geologists in the early 19th century, realize that this is a very serious scientific theory dealing with a very serious scientific problem. Next slide, please. The biggest, the most important example of the kind of problem it is this kind of thing. This is a very famous block of granite. You see the scale from the little hammer-wielding geologist at the foot of it. This is a manuscript sketch, which is stuck several hundred feet above the city of Neuchâtel and its lake, at the far side of the Swiss plain from the high Alps. And the kind of geologists here will know that granites can quite easily be recognized, specific granites, because they're all slightly different, and they're rather like different kinds of handwriting or something like that. It's pretty easy to find out where this granite has originated, because it's sitting on a limestone base of the Jura Hills. And it could be traced back, it was traced back in the very early 19th century, to its source in the high Alps, about 100 kilometers away. It has somehow moved 100 kilometers up over, next slide will show, oh no, next slide is, that's my picture of it. It's now rather overgrown in the middle of the forest, but it's got a commemorative plaque on it because it's historically so important. But I took this photograph while I was happened to be on my own, so I couldn't put a figure in to show the scale. But it is as large as a decent-sized cottage. It's moved 100 kilometers, or 60 miles roughly, up and down over hills. The next slide shows a early 19th century map of it, which I wish I had my pointer. But anyway, this is in the high Alps here. The granite had its origin there. It had clearly come all the way down the the upper Rhone Valley, across the head of the Lake of Geneva, across the Swiss plain, which in fact, as you can see from the profile below, is not really a plain, it's low hills, and that erratic block that I just showed you pictures of ended up on the far side of that lake in the top left-hand corner. How on earth did it get there? It's the best suggestion at the time was put forward by the Prussian geologist who made this map, Leopold von Buch, was that it was some kind of what we might now call a kind of turbidity current, a sort of enormous mass of perhaps a very muddy water might have been able to sustain these. And it's that erratic I showed you is just one of hundreds. It's an exceptionally large one, but there are hundreds or thousands of them. It's a huge phenomenon. And it seemed to need, on good Newtonian principles, it seemed to need an equally huge source, a huge origin, huge causal origin. So, next slide. Here's another one from the 1840s, from a book in the 1840s, was discovered and was well known much earlier than that. Again, you can see the size of it. This is in the upper Rhone Valley, but high above the valley floor, and that one is about 30 kilometers, I think, from the source area where that particular granite very clearly, unambiguously, unquestionably came from. Next slide shows, I think, my modern picture of it. It's now rather ingloriously in a hospital car park, but you can just see in the distance, perhaps, a sense that this is several hundred feet above the floor of the Rhone Valley. How on earth did it get there? That is the diluvial theory trying to make next slide, an explanation of it. Here is a very good attempt at making an explanation of it. This is James Hall's theory of how you might, what the origin of tsunamis might be, and you see this is 5 successive snapshots, as it were. Notice the town on the left. You see in this last one is being overwhelmed by a tsunami, which when I first began writing the sequel to this volume, when I first began writing this volume, I felt I had to explain to an audience of non-specialists, non-geologists, what on earth a tsunami was. Now everybody knows what a tsunami is. So the theory at the time was that the diluvial theory was that it might have been due to what I like to call a mega tsunami, something beside which what happened around the Indian Ocean, whenever it was, a couple of years ago, would have been a very small-scale event. There was no reason to suppose that if you magnified the causal event of some kind of upheaval of the ocean floor, why you shouldn't have a very much larger effect. Effects being sort of proportional to causes, again, with Newtonian view. So the next slide shows this same man's Hall's detailed map of the Corstorphine Hills just to the west of Edinburgh, showing this very striking and bizarre topography, which he attributed to this diluvial event, this geological deluge. And it was obvious starting point to interpret this deluge as being equivalent to the only comparably big event that was recorded in early human history, namely the biblical deluge. But as I say, it wasn't just the biblical deluge, it was also similar events recorded in, or supposedly recorded in, the ancient literatures of various other non-European cultures. So, next slide. This was extended by the great French naturalist Georges Cuvier into an explanation of the apparently sudden extinction of the very large extinct mammal species, which he was a brilliant enough anatomist to be able to reconstruct from their bones. This, in modern terms, the Pleistocene megafauna. How had these things? This is these are some of the teeth of the extinct hippopotamus, which was wandering around northwest Europe, not very apparently in the very recent geologically recent past, but prehistoric, of course. And Cuvier, next slide, not only reconstructed all these. Here's his mastodon. Not only reconstructed all these creatures, showed that they were distinct from any living species, so they were definitely extinct, but suggested that this same diluvial event, or the same geological deluge, could have been responsible for wiping them out. And this was a very good and fertile scientific theory. And Cuvier, as I've already said, extended this, just he absorbed the Genesis story into a whole series of multicultural flood stories, and certainly was not being literal about them, because obviously if you take the story of Noah's flood, it does not suggest anything like a mega tsunami. So they were using the Genesis account as a historical document that might well be a pretty garbled account, but nevertheless have a core of historicity to it. So the next slide, please. So this was then slightly narrowed down by William Buckland, the first professor of geology at Oxford. This is his picture of his map of the Oxford region, in effect, showing with a stippling the telltale erratic pebbles of a specific kind, which he could show had been swept from their origin right up in the Midlands in Warwickshire, through two gaps in the Cotswolds, down past Oxford and down through the Goring Gap, where the Thames goes past Reading and all the way to London. How had this happened? It obviously couldn't be attributed to the present river system at all. So this was a kind of evidence. And Buckland, because of the specific political situation in Oxford, made a great thing of this being, the geological deluge being the very same event as Noah's flood. But he actually became more and more in a minority on that point. What happened was that the evidence for some kind of geological deluge became stronger and stronger. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these scratch rocks were one of the very most puzzling features that suggested that an area had been swept over by some huge, perhaps a huge turbidity current of some kind. Next one. I'm going to go through these very quickly. And this is from a large-scale map of a point in central Sweden, where the little tailed arrows you can see trending this way, paying no attention to the topography, showed where the direction of the scratches, that something extraordinary had passed over this area. Next slide. Going through. This is the same Swedish geologist's map of the whole of south of Sweden. We can see the small tailed arrows trending more or less southwards right across the whole country. What on earth had produced this? Next slide. As the years went by into the 1830s, this is just my rough draft of a map that will be published in a smarter form, showed the directions and extent of these traces of the geological deluge, which were known by the late 1830s. Quite astonishingly large-scale phenomenon. Because what happened then, something we know, next slide, I think it's the last one, was that it was overtaken by everything was reinterpreted as the signs of an ice age. And this is a map of going back to the Rhone Valley, a map that was produced showing what I call a mega glacier, which had extended far beyond the tiny little glaciers that still exist in the Alps, filling the entire upper Rhone Valley across the site of what's now the Lake of Geneva, spreading out and pushing right up onto the Jura Hills, which are in that arc at the top. An enormous phenomenon. It's reinterpreted so that the geological deluge suddenly became, within a few years, became reinterpreted as an ice age. But this was not, I suggest, a case of religion retreating in the face of science. What happened simply was a very characteristic thing of the sciences being corrigible in the light of new evidence. And all that happened was that there was a gradually better differentiation between the strange geological deluge, which was then formed into the Ice Age on the one hand, and turned out that whatever the Noah's flood story referred to must be a much more recent event, and specifically a much more limited one. So I've got to get going quickly. So this left this reinterpretation of the geological deluge as biblical, as separate from the biblical flood, left the flood issue as a more recent and local, probably Mesopotamian event, because that's this in the early 19th century. They thought that the Mesopotamia was probably where Eden might have been, was the birth area of the human species in some way or another. But I want to sort of emphasize that this same period where geology was developing as an immensely successful new science was also equally a period when scholarly biblical criticism was developing, particularly in German universities, where the Bible was being treated as part of antiquity. And this was not always in the interests of debunking the religious meaning of the Bible, but was often, as often, I think, in the service of a search for the original meaning. So at the roots of this supposed conflict, or it's a conflict enough, but I think we need to think of it with a social dimension, because it was very often between the educated and the uneducated. At the roots of it, of course, is the issue of literalism. And this is as true of the 19th century battle between the scientific geologists, many of them religious people, versus the scriptural geologists, so-called, miscalled geologists. And there's a similarity between that and the 21st century conflicts between scientific geology and creationist fundamentalism. So the problem, I think, is fundamentalism of all kinds, including, of course, the atheistic kind, peddled by people like Dawkins. Now, I think I'm going to have to stop at that point, because there's more I could say, but I think there's little time for questions and comments that you may have on what I've said.
Now, there's obviously a great deal more scholarly things you could say, which are available in the university library, I know.
Also in Heifers. Very good value. I have to have my say. There's a sequel just about to go to press.
Excellent. Well, as many of you know, we want to finish at 2 o'clock sharp because people have other things to do, but that gives us lots of time for questions. So, does anybody want to kick off with any comments or questions about what we've heard today?
Yes.
You mentioned that the deluge or flood had been sort of documented in the literature of other cultures and stuff. I was wondering if you could sort of comment briefly on sort of what types of literature, for example, is it sort of like narrative account, scientific account?
Yes, the
locations.
Yes, I mean the Chinese accounts. But see, I mean, I'm not a sinologist, and I have no idea what the modern, current interpretation of these bits of literature are. What I do know is that they were known to somebody like one of my heroes is Georges Cuvier, for example, who first integrated these stories with his scientific evidence for extinction. That he took them. He interpreted them in a pretty good, hard-nosed way. In other words, he said, look, these stories look as though they've probably got a core of genuine historicity to them, but they are overlaid with all sorts of legendary characteristics, because they were composed in the context of rulers who wanted to aggrandize themselves and their claims and so on, show that they went back to the dot and so on. So I mean, I've no idea what modern Chinese scholars, sinologists, think about these stories, what status they have. All I know is that 200 years ago, they were beginning to be explored by European scholars and were taken to be possibly genuine historical records, however garbled. They might nevertheless have a core of historicity, and which did suggest that there had been some major, exceptional watery catastrophe way back in the very dimmest, earliest kind of human history. So so Huvier and many others sort of equated these potentially, tentatively, with, well, this might have been the same sort of event that that generated the story of Noah's flood. So it was only a bit later, a generation later, that they realised, no, these stories, however genuine they may be, date from much, much too recently by geological standards to be an explanation of, for example, all this diluvial stuff that these...
Is there that sort of evidence in places like China, the diluvial?
Well, whether there's any physical evidence, I don't know. That was never talked about. This was purely textual. So they were these Chinese scholars of the Chinese documents in the early 19th century, were doing on those documents what other scholars, very often their colleagues, were doing on the biblical documents. In other words, doing some really careful textual analysis and working out, what the original form of the story might have been, what the original meaning of the words might have been, so that you were interpreting it correctly in terms of the period in which the documents had first been produced. That was the intention.
There's a book, The Bible as History, which is now very old, by Werner Keller, which describes the Babylonian myths, which are preserved on the original cuneiform clay tablets and so on, and also describes going down through 3.7 meters of water-laid clay, which gives the idea that living in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, they knew about catastrophic floods and were creating those myths around real historical events that people had experienced. And those, the authors, relate to the biblical flood stories, which were around and get reinterpreted within the context of ancient Israel, saying, this is our God. But there's books on it, yes.
You described a myth, the myth of the scientist versus the
Yes.
religion, people
Yeah.
of capitalism are,
Yeah.
as being a story held for a purpose.
Yes.
And I wondered if you'd speculated as to why these people continue to propagate this myth today.
Well, they want to undermine religious belief, I think, is putting it very simply and bluntly. I think it's as simple as that. So any weapon that can be used to show how irrational the foundations of religious belief are all grist to their mill.
And on the other side?
Well, the other side, people wanting to claim that religious belief is still, possible, legitimate, and defensible in the modern world. I mean, I don't know whether that answers the kind of answer that you wanted, but I mean, that's what it seems to me. And it seems to me that but I mean, if you I don't want to sort of make a thing out of Dawkins. I don't think he deserves it. But I mean, if you look at his latest book on the God Delusion, or whatever it's called, and you see the incredible ignorance of a man about anything to do with religion. I mean, it's appalling that he pontificates about, he uses his genuine and well-earned authority as a scientist for a totally improper purpose. And it seems to me that it's exactly parallel to what the religious fundamentalists are doing in exactly the same way, the same combination of extraordinary arrogance, dogmatism, and sheer ignorance of what it is that they're proposing to campaign against.
I think we'll take another question. Yes, you commented that the late 18th century there was a sense of deep time.
Yes.
It was qualitative rather
Yes.
than quantitative.
Yes.
But I seem to remember people like Buffon were sort of coming up with various numbers. And I wondered, and I seem to remember 70,000 with one of them, and he changed his mind a few times. So I wondered where they got those numbers from.
Well, he got his. Read my book.
Read
a whole section on Buffon's time scale.
Right.
And the short answer is he got it from his physics as he understood it, because he had thought on other grounds that the Earth was a cooling body, and he did some very brilliant experiments on model globes heating them in a furnace to white heat, and then made of different materials, different diameters and so on, and measuring how quickly they cooled down. And then he did this very bold extrapolation from a few inches up to a few thousand, many thousands of miles diameter, and said, and so he did a calculation. But I think the crucial thing about that is that it was, he actually thought behind the scenes, as it were, that his estimates were probably underestimates, but he didn't keep them secret for fear of the religiously orthodox, because even the ones that he did publish, were far longer than the traditional short time scale that you got in, say, somebody like Burnett, a few thousand years. So, he got it out of physics, but by that time it doesn't seem to me, actually, to make much difference whether you're thinking in terms of deep time of tens of thousands of years, or tens of millions, or even a few billions of years. That doesn't actually operationally make much difference at that level of science that they were doing then. Obviously, as time goes on, it becomes more and more important. Just how many zeros you've got on the end of the time scale. Yes.
Yes. Given the amount of abuse reserved by the fundamentalists for Christians who are also scientists, I think that the explanation that these people merely wish to establish religious belief is not really very adequate. I think it's time that people really studied what the motives behind the fundamentalist movement actually are, and actually look into the psychology of it. It's not really to support the cause of religion.
Well, I agree with that. I would only say that I think the psychology, that's only part of it. And I think much more importantly, we need to examine, as some people have done in a scholarly way on the American scene, we need to examine the socio-political context of it. And because it is very specific social groups who are putting forward this kind of thing, and it's clear that they're, I don't want to get into this because it's too big a topic. But I agree with you that what I said as answer to this lady here was a sort of first approximation, a kind of very rough response. But I agree it's an inadequate one.
I wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit on the historiography of it. You mentioned Andrew Dixon,
Yes.
Was he one of the first people to start writing history of geology in these terms?
No. It actually goes back to the period I've been talking about in the sort of early 19th century. But it becomes generalised in, say, somebody like Andrew Dixon White, into a sort of a kind of mega narrative, as it were. This is what's been happening all along, and you bring in Galileo, and you can bring in Darwin, and you can bring in the sort of geology versus Genesis of the early 19th century, and so on. This is all part of a long-term campaign how there's been a perennial and endemic conflict between science with a capital S, which I think is a nonsense anyway, and religion with a capital S, which is equal nonsense because there's such diversity on both sides. It does no good to reify the two things in that way.
I think we have time for just one last question.
Sorry.
You mentioned the dangers of the capital S and the capital R.
Yeah.
But certainly people in the 19th century seem to be sort of caught within that, even quite intelligent people, because in Ian Wilson's book, God's Funeral, about 19th century doubt, he has a letter from Tennyson to Haslam saying, I can cope, my evangelical faith has been frayed, basically, but I can cope with some things, but I can't cope with the noise of the geologist's hammers. That's what's ruined my faith, he said. And apparently also Lyell was very careful back in 1835. He was very anxious not to publish his book because of all these sorts of, the whole sort of religious thing was going to be raised by it.
I think that last thing is as much part of a myth, to be honest,
okay.
as the very similar myth to the effect that Charles Darwin was scared stiff of publishing his Origin of Species
okay.
for reasons of I mean, you look at what was going on in the early to mid-19th century, even in this country, which I say is a very peculiar exception to the rest of the intellectual world. I just don't see that kind of argument has any plausibility at all, because they weren't going to get clobbered or persecuted in any way for doing this sort of thing. There was such a wide range of opinions were acceptable, and were often, you have tremendous arguments in print, and they didn't pull their punches about these things. But that's very different from saying you're going to be thrown into jail or put into the stocks or something like that.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very good point for me, actually, as a geologist, to remind you that the first thing you learn on the first lecture in geology is that the present is the key to the past. And I think this is a splendid example of how the past can be the key to the present, because how these issues have been dealt with in the past, I think, is a live issue for how we should deal with them today. So thank you very much again.